Good afternoon. I'm Howard Husick of the American Enterprise Institute. I'm a domestic policy fellow here, and I'm pleased to welcome you to a conversation with Yoni Applebaum, Deputy Executive Editor of The Atlantic and author of the new book, Stuck: How the Privileged and Propertied Broke the Engine of American Opportunity. I should make it very clear at the outset that I am not a subscriber to Signal, and I did not invite Yoni here by mistake. Although apparently it's a good way to become ambassador to the United Nations.
It might have been a good career move.
Yeah. This is an important new book, I'm going to hold it up again, about the relationship between the availability of housing, which both parties today agree is in too short supply, and larger matters, including social mobility and household prosperity. Stuck is primarily a book of history, however, one that looks back on housing choices which were once common but which have been reduced. And he compares the present to the past in ways that we hope can now inspire improvement. As someone with my own deep interest in the subject, I'll engage Yoni in conversation about the book, as well as talk about how we can begin as a country to rectify the problem he ably describes. It's good to see some young people here at AEI. This is all about whether you're going to be able to afford a house, so thanks for coming. We'll discuss the book for about 45 minutes, after which we'll invite questions from the audience, including those of you who are online, and you'll see the place to send that on your screen. Yoni Applebaum is a Deputy Executive Editor of The Atlantic, social and cultural historian of the United States. Before joining The Atlantic, he was a lecturer on history at Harvard University. He previously taught at Babson College and at Brandeis, and it's at Brandeis he received his PhD in American history. So, Yoni, you talk about we're stuck, and you mean that physically, that we don't get to move as easily, and we can't move to the places we want to move. So to saying that we've stuck, there must have been a time when we weren't stuck. When you drive along and you get stuck in the mud, you weren't always stuck in the mud, suddenly you hit the mud. So my question to you is, describe this pre-stuck history of the United States and why you're extolling it.
Yeah, let's start on Moving Day, which was an event that happened on different dates in different cities and regions, but was fairly ubiquitous in the 19th century United States, well into the 20th. It was a day on which all unwritten leases in the area expired at the same time. And a quarter, a third, half the people in the jurisdiction would get up and swap housing between sunup and sundown, right? They'd wake up early, take all of their worldly belongings, pile it on the curb, flag down a passing cartman who was charging usurious rates, pile everything in the back. The cartman would go careening through the streets because the more runs he could fit in, the better he'd do. Things would go bouncing out of the cart. You'd arrive at the new place, and you had to squeeze past the family coming out in order to get into the new townhouse, the new apartment, the new single-family home. This was an American cultural institution. People assumed that they would move. They assumed that they would go from one place to another throughout their lives. Americans tended to look at housing the way I might look at a nice car or an iPhone. That is, you have it for a few years, but then you can upgrade to a better model. And the magic of Moving Day was pretty much everyone who moved was upgrading. Because if you were adding new inventory, typically at the top of the market, the wealthiest would move up. The homes they vacated could go to the people who are moderately less affluent. And you can trace through the property records a chain of 12, 15 moves as the properties filter down. And even the person moving into that 15th apartment, which had just been vacated, was leaving a place that was slightly worse in some respect than the place that they were coming to. It also gave the renters, and we're talking mostly about renters, although owners also did this, a remarkable amount of leverage. With so many people moving on that single day, those who wanted to stay could ask of their landlords for new improvements to the property in
Wait a
exchange
minute,
for
the
the continued
tenants
lease.
had leverage?
Well, I know the tenants had leverage because the landlords complained about moving day relentlessly. And although not at every time in every place, there are moments where the market tightens and it inverts, but most of the time, the landlords say, this is a crazy institution, let's get rid of it. The tenants have too much leverage here. So that was the United States at the peak. But to understand what's really magical about this, I think you've got to go back a couple hundred years before to Europe, and we'll do this briefly. But the people who came to the United States, starting with the earliest European arrivals, and then carrying through for hundreds of years, were leaving societies in which almost every significant aspect of their identity was inherited at birth. Where they lived, what their religion was, what their occupation was, these were heritable, right? And above all, their place in the social hierarchy, who they were, what their standing was, sometimes by law, sometimes by custom, but almost always immovable. You were who you were born. And you could look out the parish window and see a row of headstones with your family name on it. You could see where your great-grandfather was buried, and you could see the vacant plots where your great-grandson might be buried one day. You expected to stay in that place to inherit that role. When people come to the United States, they're not utopians. They more or less intend to create a perfected version of European society. Many different versions, right? So the Dutch are up to something different in New Amsterdam than the Puritans are in New England. But they're not, and nobody comes here, none of the major backers of these settlements are looking for a social revolution. Nevertheless, that's what they get. And the spur to that is physical geographic mobility. The chance to move from one place to another sets Americans in this new land free to decide their own identities. Within this country, individual identity becomes not strictly heritable, but largely a matter of a sequence of choices that we make. Americans are individualists in that we can define our individual identity by virtue of the groups with which we choose to affiliate. Americans are quick to recognize this. The Massachusetts Bodies of Liberties in 1643 is the first to incorporate a right to leave. It doesn't sound like much, right? Like Massachusetts, love it or leave it.
Well, there's East Germany.
Right, that's right. And there was England, which you did not have the right to leave necessarily. You needed the Crown's permission to depart, particularly if you occupied certain occupations, if you'd committed certain offenses, you had no right to leave the realm. In Massachusetts, you do. 200 years later, in the Ohio Territory, we couple that to a right to arrive. We make belonging to a community a matter of individual choice. That had not been the case for the first couple hundred years in the United States. You can move into a community and be warned out. They could deliver a notice to your door that says, essentially, we don't want you here. And in the communities where we have the best records, most people who tried to move in were warned out. Even if they were engaged to a girl in town, even if they had bought property, even if they had a job, they had no right to stay within the community. And so by making communities a matter of individual choice, we are creating a new kind of society, not just a new housing modality.
And so connect the dots for me between that and prosperity.
This is a remarkable fact. In any decade you care to examine in the American past, if you match up as best you can the characteristics of a sample of people who moved and a sample of people who stayed put, the movers will outperform them on average economically. Not just are they earning more when they move, they're likelier to jump social and occupational brackets, however you care to measure those things. And those effects are not just a single generation. The second generation will outperform the first, right? So the kids of the people who have moved will do even better than their parents did, and they'll do a whole lot better than the kids of the people who stayed. The gap widens in that second generation. And so this is the magic of geographic mobility in America. We have a society which is socially dynamic because you can reinvent your identity by moving, and a society that is economically dynamic because you can change your economic fortunes by changing your geographic location. Those two things come out of the remarkable degree of American mobility, which came out of the remarkable profusion of American housing.
Yeah, I mean, you can just imagine if you move to California for the gold rush, you're more likely to find gold than if you don't.
You are, and even if you fail, as most gold rush,
That's
right,
true.
most of them fail. And
They invent Levi's instead.
Right. That was the thing. You had second and third chances in America. You were not, failure in a static society is awfully hard to transcend. You take your shot and you fail and you're stuck with the consequences. In the United States, The serial relocations meant that you could be a gold miner and stitch some jeans out of your canvas tent and take them down, right? And then you can open a store. You can move your geographic location out of the gold fields and down into a center of commerce and take a second shot at your fortune and really make bank. And so that kind of story you can tell. Whenever you open a biography of a 19th century American, you will find some version of that, right? They're born here. Lincoln is maybe as good an example of this as anyone, right? His father and his mother, one is of Virginian extraction, the other of New England. His father has two different farms that he loses to title disputes. He hops over to to Indiana. He keeps going to Illinois, right? That there's a series of relocations here. And ultimately, they plop Lincoln down in a state that is booming at precisely the moment that he comes of age. And that is not coincidence. Had he stayed at that first farm, he would never have been president of the United States. It is the chance to move to the places where the opportunities are burgeoning that puts 19th century Americans in the path of prosperity.
And that's really what we're going to talk about, the constraints on doing exactly that right now. I follow New York real estate very closely. New York has the lowest turnover of any 10 metros. We think about if you can make it in New York, try to get a place when you move to New York, you're locked out. And famously, if you want to move to Silicon Valley from Buffalo, well, housing is 10 times as more expensive. And that's really kind of the core point that you're making in the book, is that these choices have been foreclosed. So let's talk about how did we reach that point. In an essay that I love, in 1968, a gentleman at the Yale Law School wrote a paper called Note on Large Lot Zoning. And David Schoenberg determined that by zoning 2 acres or 5 acres, you basically kept everybody out. Now, he had a lot to say about race and the impulse toward racial exclusion, and you do talk about that in the book, even going back so far as Chinese laundries and California being an anti-Chinese zoning act. But you call out reform as being complicit in what changed, what foreclosed the mobility option. You even say progressive reform. And I have to say, that stunned me. So connect those dots for us.
Yeah, so the origin of zoning in the United States is in Modesto, California. That's our first zoning ordinance, and it's done to exclude the Chinese from Modesto. The first citywide zoning ordinance happens in New York City, and the genesis of it is an effort to push the Jews back into the Lower East Side. And so there is a strong strain of exclusion on a racial or ethnic basis that runs through zoning. But that is not the only animating impulse of zoning. Zoning, the scholar Robert Wiebe writes a book about progressivism, which he calls The Search for Order. And this is a good way to understand the original progressive movement. It arises out of conditions of comparative chaos in thriving cities, which see much more mobility of all kinds, geographic mobility, social mobility. They feel like unsettled and disordered places. They have real problems, I should add, right? And progressive reformers come in and they say, we would like to bring order out of chaos. We would like to apply the fruits of reason and science and expertise. We would like to find ways to apply these tools to improve the lives of the people around us, right? That is, I think, a version of the progressive impulse that the progressive reformers themselves would have articulated and recognized. But it has consequences, because that search for order twists on the people who promote it in 2 different ways. One is that none of us is quite as rational as we suppose. And so the version of order that the progressive reformers repeatedly champion is nostalgic and often overtly racist, at the very least racist in its effects. And so what they're pushing is a scheme which says other people should live like we do. It is not a pluralistic version of America. It's not a particularly welcoming or accepting version in most of its iterations. And they are pushing a scheme for social order that is going to be centrally planned by the people who have sufficient education, have the right sorts of values, and centrally imposed. Zoning allows them to think that you can create a rational city, that you could solve all of the city's problems by sorting things out. I liken it to sort of separating the peas and carrots from the potatoes, from the roast beef on the plate, right? Everything's
The commercial from the residential.
Yeah, everything goes in its right quadrant of the city. You separate the commercial from the residential, from the industrial, the dense residential, like apartment buildings, from the single-family homes. But urban life is a stew, right? It actually coheres. You get the benefits of urban agglomeration from people bouncing into each other, from the mix of uses, from the mix of residents. That is what makes cities tick. And so there's something deeply anti-urban about the original zoning impulse. And also, in most of its iterations, something deeply discriminatory, because the people who are not complying with this vision are typically immigrants, internal migrants, people who are more recently arrived in the city, have fewer resources. They're not living in tenements because they think that tenements are vastly superior to Fifth Avenue mansions. They're living in tenements because they can't afford Fifth Avenue mansions, right? And so zoning, as it gets implemented, and building codes and other tools of regulation, become ways for the educated elite to control the working poor and their destinies, to try to channel them toward a particular set of actions, a particular set of values. And it's hard for me to really convey how utopian this impulse is. The zoning reformers genuinely sell the problem of the built environment, of buildings, of the mix of uses, as the source of everything that is wrong in the city. And so bad construction, bad housing is responsible for disease,
Fires.
for fires, for crime, for moral turpitude,
Right.
for sexual promiscuity, for the decay of values, the decline of faith. Like almost any great anxiety of the early 20th century gets pinned back on the tenement house as its ultimate cause. And the solution is to create a kind of urban order that will ban, in particular, multifamily apartments, but that will try to impose this kind of ordered rationality. It sounds almost crazy to think that somebody living in an apartment building will become morally dissolute by nature of being in the apartment building, but they're quite explicit about it. They propound even a eugenics theory of this, where within a couple generations, even if you start with a reasonably respectable apartment building, apartment living is so morally degrading that the only people who can survive and reproduce are the most degenerate. And by the third generation, you'll just have endemically degenerate populations residing in your apartment districts. They believe this, they say it, they tout it, and they seek in consequence to ban most of the forms of housing that house the working classes.
And so connect the dots for us between zoning, which sounds technical and boring, and the decline in housing supply and variegation that you call out in the book.
Yeah, so zoning is a boring word, right? When I start talking about zoning, people's eyes glaze over. Zoning, just to define it for us, right, is the novel legal claim that something that does not harm anyone can be legal in one part of town and illegal in another part of town. Everybody understands at the time that zoning is first proposed that this is a constitutional absurdity. And in fact, there is something of a race to find legal mechanisms to justify it, to make it so ubiquitous by the time it gets up to the Supreme Court that something which even its authors admit is unconstitutional will be upheld by the time it makes it as far as the justices. The reason this claim is so controversial is that, as the Supreme Court says when it ultimately upheld zoning, says, well, zoning is perfectly reasonable. It's like a pig in the parlor as opposed to the barnyard. It's a proper thing in an improper place. The problem with that as a legal analogy is what you are essentially saying is we're going to zone our cities and some of their residents will get to live in the parlor and other folks are going to be consigned to the barnyard, right? Because there is some place where that pig's going to live and it's not going to be on the nice side of town. So that is what zoning is. It's not land use law. We had extensive land use law and regulations in this country prior to the advent of zoning, but it was all based on nuisance law, on the idea that some use of the land was harming the adjacent properties.
A slaughterhouse.
for example, or a brickyard, or right there, a tannery, right? That many uses were regulated. You couldn't do something on your property that was going to hurt your neighbor. But within those bounds, if what you wanted to do on your property was absurd or tasteless, you had the right to do it. And what that meant was that as cities grew, the housing was serially replaced. So what might start as a single-family home, a farmhouse on a wide lot of land, might get some neighboring houses. And then at some point, somebody might buy up and tear down the farmhouses and erect houses on smaller lots that were closer together. Maybe they'd be replaced by townhomes. Those townhomes might eventually give way to a 6-story walk-up apartment building. With the advent of the elevator, you can go even higher, right? And this is how cities grew across time. It was not one static form of urban fabric.
So zoning freezes things.
Yes, it freezes things, and it makes it deliberately hard to grow. So it doesn't just freeze things as they are. In many American cities today, much or most of the structures would not be legal under the present zoning.
Right.
It actually rolls it back and says, we don't even want as dense and vibrant cities as we have at present.
Some of the most expensive structures in the country, by the way, if you look at brownstones in Brooklyn, you couldn't build them today.
You couldn't. And freezing the form of an urban environment, which is often done out of sort of a misplaced sense of nostalgia, does not freeze the urban environment. If you look at a block of brownstones in any, or townhouses in any city in America, right, two things I'd say. One is a lot of people, when you start talking about the problems with zoning, say, you know, my God, if we didn't have zoning, it would be terrible. If you look in any city in America that existed prior to about 1920, the neighborhood today that is the hottest place to live will be a place that was erected prior to the advent of zoning. With lots of density and mixed uses. Right, Georgetown in DC, the Brooklyn Heights or Prospect Park, you know, like wherever you're going across the country, you can find these neighborhoods. They are pre-zoning neighborhoods, and today, people love them. So that's one thing I'd say. The other is that although people love them, those neighborhoods often struggle to support things like schools and retail, because on any block, you'll typically have about a third as many residents as lived on that block at the time it was originally built. We live at much lower densities these days. Our families are smaller. We're less likely to take in adult boarders. We're less likely to have multi-generational households. The actual lived density of those brownstones or townhomes will only be about a third of what it was designed to be. And so then people notice that the corner store has closed, or that the elementary school is getting turned into condos because there's no more kids left in the neighborhood. Freezing the urban form cannot actually preserve the community. In fact, to the extent that as Americans have grown more affluent over the last 100 years, we've grown accustomed to more space, freezing the urban form guts the community. It guts the actual people who constitute a community in the name of preservation.
And so how does that translate to, I'm living in Cleveland, where I grew up, by the way, and I want to move to San Jose because I want to be a coder for Mark Zuckerberg. How does what you describe about zoning as a technical matter translate to constraining my choices?
So I want you to think for a moment about a janitor living in a Rust Belt city or in the rural South, somebody who is in a place with relatively little economic growth and relatively few prospects. They're probably not earning very much as a janitor. If 50 years ago, if they relocated, you know, from Alabama to San Jose, their income would have gone up by about 70%.
70.
It's an astonishing jump, right? Same job, different metropolitan area, but the demand for labor is much higher in the Bay Area, right? Because of the prosperity brought there by the Silicon Valley boom. And so the same person doing the same work can earn a whole lot more. Not only is he going to earn a lot more, but he becomes much more likely to be able to jump occupational brackets, right? Maybe he works for a while as a janitor, but he goes to night school, or somebody says, hey, you know, I'll pay you even more to come do this other job, because those opportunities exist in a place that's growing economically. His housing costs go up a little, maybe about 20%, but that's trivial compared to the gains. He does a lot better. Not only does he do a lot better, but the little girl he brought with him from Alabama who enrolls in the school in San Jose gets a better education than she would have gotten, has different peer group effects than she would have had, and is much more proximate to many more economic opportunities as she comes of age. The trajectory of her life is altered much more than that of her father's. That is the upside A lawyer, by the way, who had moved from Alabama to San Jose will also see his income 50 years ago go up by about 70%. And so whether you were at the top of the income bracket or at the bottom, if you relocated from a poorer place in America to a wealthier one, throughout American history, you would have done a lot better. And in fact, from the founding until 1970 or so, the gap between the poorest and the richest places in America was narrowing consistently by migration. So people would move out of the poor places toward the richer ones. They would tighten the labor market they left behind. They'd send money home, what we call remittances in an international context, right? But just like sending some help back to your parents, right? And so they were infusing poor areas with cash. They were tightening their labor markets and pulling more people into gainful work. And they themselves, by relocating toward opportunity, had improved their own incomes and the trajectories of their children. That was how America worked. That was why this was a dynamic society with remarkable rates of social mobility. Fast forward 50 years. If that lawyer from Alabama moves, his income still goes up by like 70%. And he does, well in San Jose.
Zuckerberg he needs a lot of lawyers.
Yeah, there's lots of demand for attorneys in Silicon Valley these days. And his housing costs go up. They'll eat up most of the gains, but he'll still end up a little bit ahead if he moves from Alabama to San Jose. Not so for the janitor. The janitor who moves will see the same jump in income that he would have had 50 years ago. But now the housing costs more than eat up the gains. He ends up with less in the bank account at the end of every 2-week period, right? Like his paycheck comes home and he looks at it and it doesn't even cover his expenses. Americans are really smart. They don't necessarily have to do complicated econometric calculations. They know this. They know this anecdotally. They know it intuitively. And so they've stopped moving. The places that can give them better incomes and different life trajectories have shut them out, have refused to build the housing that would have given them the opportunity to change the trajectory of their lives. And so increasingly, they stay where they are. And by increasingly, I mean that in the 19th century, 1 out of 3 Americans moved every year. And last year, we got new numbers for the census. It's down to 1 out of 13. That shocking decline in the rate of annual mobility is, I think, the biggest social change of the last 50 years. And it is the underlying trend that explains a whole host of other things that have come to our attention.
Let me push back on a couple of points.
Yeah.
One is there's a sociologist who held forth here at George Washington University for many years, Amitai Etzioni, the late Amitai Etzioni. He was a communitarian. At the risk of oversimplifying, the communitarian believes that one's fortunes are framed in part by our relationships with our community. Community is very important. So one could argue that you're overemphasizing individualism, moving in order to prosper, and that something about America has always been attached to place, and that every place has its own Rotary Club, its own city council, its own local control and local government. And people invest in those places. And you're saying, don't worry about that. Who cares that you were born in this place and that your grandparents were born there? You got to pull up stakes. Isn't that a kind of a heartless approach?
It's a great question. And I think I'd actually flip it around. I am tremendously concerned about the decline of American civic life. Our institutions are withering. We are famously bowling alone, right? But it's not just the civic groups. Church attendance has been down on the whole. May finally have plateaued, but that's been a 50-year slide. Across a wide barometer of indicators of our civic health, the same 50 years from 1970 to the present that mobility has declined, our civic life has declined. And if you rewind and you go back and you read the travel logs from Bryce and Tocqueville and others who are wandering the early United States, they all make 2 observations in common. One is Americans are crazy because we're always moving. It was a necessary part of the European travel itinerary to stop in some city on moving day and then to write home to all of your relatives about how crazy the Americans were for doing this. And Tocqueville says we're restless in the midst of prosperity. There's something wrong in our national character, that we're not satisfied with what we were born to be. We want something more for ourselves and our children. They're very disquieted by this. The other thing they say is, wow, Americans have such a rich and robust civic life. Their communities are so vibrant. I wish we had that. And they never put the two halves together. If you get a graph of participation in American civic life and put it up against a graph of the peaks and troughs of American mobility, geographic mobility, they align perfectly. The reason that our civic life and our communities were so vibrant was the constant infusion of new arrivals. Groups over time atrophy. You can track this. If on average it's something like a steady rate of de-accession of 5 to 10% of members per year. That's true when the group is booming. It's true when the group is shrinking. What differentiates those boom and busts is not the rate at which members leave. It is the rate at which members arrive. And the people who are likeliest to join the Rotary Club are the new people in town. It's uncomfortable to join a group. It's uncomfortable to strike up a conversation with a stranger. You're likeliest to do it when you have no alternative. When you've arrived someplace new, you're looking around, you don't know a soul in the place, and you talk to the person sitting down next to you at the bar. You show up in church on Sunday, even though you haven't been in several years, because you're looking to connect. That was what drove American community. It was the thing that made our communities really special. And that driver of active choice. America for 200 years has been the only country on earth in which a majority of adults no longer belong to the confession into which they were born, right? It's an amazing stat. It goes back to the Second Great Awakening. Americans chose their religion. Sometimes they chose to double down on the religion to which they were born. Right, no establishment. You could move wherever you were. You could try a new church. You could switch faiths entirely. There were no rules around that. And it meant two things. One, that people did choose and they did switch. Also, that when people chose to stay, it was a choice to stay. You weren't Catholic just because you'd been born Catholic, because you had the option to go down the block to the Protestant church. You were Catholic because you decided to stay Catholic. And
see J.D. Vance.
Yeah, that led to, and some people became Catholic, right, which you could. But that led to a fervence in American faith that Europeans came over here and marveled at. Both the people who stayed in the faith of their birth and the people who switched denominations ended up with sort of a proactive commitment to the community to which they belonged.
You're saying that Bob Putnamism, bowling alone, is partly related to the atrophying of civic associations because they lack new blood.
Yeah, I'm saying that's the prime cause. That the key driver of the decline in American voluntary life is that we no longer move ourselves around as we once did. And it goes beyond the individual level. We were a society in which there was a presumption of constant movement. And that was part of the engine that generated such an extraordinary profusion of groups. You could get a traveling card from the Masons or the Oddfellows or the Knights of Pythias, take it with you to a new town, show up at the lodge and present it from your old lodge, and you were accepted as a member in that new lodge. That you had a credential that testified that you weren't some scam artist, you weren't some huckster, that you had been a respectable member of the last community in which you resided, and you could take that social capital with you on the road. You don't get institutions like that if people aren't constantly moving. And it's true in a formal sense, it's true in an informal sense. America is a place where the high schools have homecoming, right? Homecoming is an American invention. It happens at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th. And it happens only in a country where the presumption is that most people who have graduated the local high school don't live there anymore, right? You don't need homecoming in Europe. You need it here.
You're already home.
You're already home. You're always home, right? There's no annual ingathering of the exiles. It comes out of northern New England. In Vermont, by 1900, there's only two places on earth that have seen 40% of the people who were born there leave, and it's Ireland and Vermont. The extraordinary exodus of Americans from the places that were shrinking economically to the places that were thriving. We look now at burnt out industrial cities and ask ourselves, what has gone wrong with the American economy? In fact, for 200 years, there have been burnt out regions of this country which are suddenly plummeting economically. The difference is not the existence of such places. It's that the traditional American solution was you packed your bags and you moved voluntarily. Today, people can't do that. And
Hard
so
to go from Flint to Houston.
it's awfully hard. I spent a week in Flint while I was writing this
Yeah,
book.
right.
Yeah,
That's why I brought it up. All right, we got to get to how to fix all this, right? And so I'll ask you, I think this hard question. Can the American tradition of local control coexist with the need to expand our housing supply with more and inexpensive choices? Local control means every jurisdiction, and we have approximately 18,000 municipalities in this country. It controls its own zoning. They have the right to set zoning, every one. They all have their own planning boards, their own zoning boards, their own boards of architectural review, all sorts of intrusive, guaranteeing, whatever you want to call it, these local bodies. We're committed to local control. Woodrow Wilson said, we don't run our communities, they run themselves. It frustrated him, by the way. Can local control, do we have to have state mandates that override the local zoning, which is your bugaboo?
So I would actually flip this around. Zoning is a state
This
power.
is the second time you're doing this to me.
Yeah. Zoning is a state power, it's not a local one, right? Municipalities only gain the right to pass zoning ordinances when Herbert Hoover convenes a committee and drafts a model zoning enabling statute that then gets picked up and adopted by states that delegate this state level authority down to local municipalities, right? So it is a state level power that the states chose 100 years ago in a novel fashion, a controversial fashion, to delegate down to local communities. The parameters have always been set by the states. So I don't think the tension here necessarily is between do communities get to control themselves or do central planners at the state level get to override their decisions. The question has always been, what are the powers that we choose to delegate to local communities and what boundaries do we place on those powers? There's not an unlimited power to zone in this country. There never has been. It's always been defined by state level
Right, but let's
statute.
talk about this as a political matter.
Yeah.
If tomorrow we started to strip, if you will, the zoning power from a lot of local communities, you'd have an outcry.
Yeah, you might, but I don't know because.
I mean, are you for that? That's what I'm saying.
Am I for that? I am for there being boundaries on how local communities exercise their zoning power, because when you look at a map at present, what you find is wild disparities, right? So some municipalities are amazingly prescriptive about their rules, and others give much more latitude. We have segregated ourselves economically in this country by virtue of this. We have prevented people from moving toward areas. There are broad public interests that are at stake in local zoning decisions as those decisions are multiplied out across many municipalities.
Right.
Whenever you get a matter of public interest that transcends a local community and the prosperity of an entire state hinges on those local decisions, the state takes an active role in shaping those decisions. Where the prosperity of the entire nation depends on those decisions, then the federal government takes an active role in shaping those decisions. Zoning is an unusual exception to this in that it's a state level power delegated down to the municipalities that despite many of the problems that it has created over the past 100 years, the states have largely left alone. And we're starting to see some changes to that. It doesn't mean limiting local control. I think that's the wrong way to conceive of it. What it ultimately means is shaping the way in which localities control themselves. So you could, for example, to pull one example up here, Japan allows zoning to be done at the local level, but it defines the categories. So it says, well, here are your basic zoning labels. Any community can use those categories as it pleases. That's up to localities. How a community decides to allocate these labels across. But you can't just invent your own new zoning category, which says, I'm going to create a bunch of rules that effectively exclude a whole subset of people from my community.
Right, but a lot of places are only single-family zoning. Mm-hmm. Does that need to be overridden in order to create townhouse complexes, 3-family houses, which you rightly, you got me at 3-decker houses, that was great. Do we need to override local zoning to permit these kind of uses more ubiquitously?
I think ultimately what we need to do is to allow the states, in a state-by-state level, I mean, this is the beauty of the federal system, but allow the states to put guardrails on these zoning designations. And yes, I suspect some states are going to look at this and say, it is not in our collective interest to allow single-family zoning. The nice thing about changing zoning is, and this was the brilliance of the system as it comes in, is that it's not retroactive, right? So if you're changing a zoning designation in a community, you're not banning all of the single-family homes that presently exist there. But you could say, for example, homes, and put up a multifamily development within our community that enables the firefighters and the daycare workers and the nurses who serve the people within this community to raise their own children in the community, or that creates elevator housing, 3-story elevator housing that allows people to retire at the time when they can no longer navigate the stairs in their house without giving up their church and their friends and their social contacts, or that allows their own kids to move in with the grandkids, even if they can't yet afford a single-family home on a 1-acre lot. Then yeah, I think that there is a role for states, if they choose to step in there and say, this is not in the public interest. What we're going to do is change the categories that communities can use, and the communities can still choose how to shape the texture of their community by using different labels in different places, but we'll put some guidelines on that.
We risk some backlash. Are there ways to persuade those local zoning authorities without having the changes that you're talking about? Is there a role for persuasion that could be successful? I
think there is, and I think you can already see a real set of shifting ground here on both the left and the right. It's less a political question these days than it is a generational one. The baby boom generation, for the most part, viewed growth as a threat. And there was a broad sense that America was exhausting its natural resources, that too much growth might not be a good thing. Today, I think there is a generational change where 20 and 30-somethings worry much, much more about a whole set of other problems, right? The inability to access opportunity, inequality written into our geographic landscape. So that generational shift is already underway. How do you persuade people? What I have found is that if the advocates of opportunity start talking about floor area ratios, minimum lot sizes, and building codes, they have already lost the battle. If you ask me, do I want an apartment building built next to my very nice single-family home? The answer is no, thank you. I'm imagining the construction noise, the dust, the loss of sunlight, the struggle for parking. That building represents things that I don't want to have happen. But if you ask that same question a different way, if you say, would I like to live in a community that's more economically diverse than the one I presently inhabit? Would I like young people to be able to move into my community?
My own children.
My own kids moving in. Do I want the school teachers who teach at the school to be able to live in the same neighborhood as the students they're instructing? If you start talking about people, and then also if you start talking about values, do you want this to be a society that is dynamic, or one in which we all have the right to control our neighbors? Do you want this to be a society in which people have the right to rise and to define their own destinies, can exercise a degree of personal agency? Or do you want it to be a society in which we tend to think in embittered terms, that the game is zero-sum and that others' gains come at our own expenses? That's when the advocates of mobility start winning the argument. Because ultimately, this is a question not about built environment. That's a red herring. It's a question about the kind of society we want to inhabit, about the kinds of opportunity we want to extend to individuals. The housing is a means to that end, but it is not the end in and of itself. I ultimately don't care whether somebody lives in a 3-decker or a townhouse or a single-family home. What I care is that my fellow Americans have the chance to do what I've done throughout my life, which is to move toward opportunity, which is something that Americans all across the economic spectrum used to be able to do, and today is almost exclusively a privilege exercised by people with large incomes and post-secondary educations.
So I'm searching for ways we might disagree, because that makes things interesting. So one of the things that happens with more state involvement in local housing markets is something called inclusionary zoning. Mm-hmm. So inclusionary zoning means you can build this apartment building, but you have to set aside 15% that's affordable, permanently affordable. right? New York City is doing this in a big way, right? Here's what worries me about this, and I'll see, and I think it's actually consistent with your concern about mobility. Once I get that good deal, right? I've hit the lottery, right? I have a permanently affordable apartment. I have a housing voucher. We're doing work here right now at AEI about mobility and housing vouchers. People stay for a really long time when they get a housing voucher, right? And so are these, not incentives, are these amelioratives to allow people of low incomes to move into higher income opportunity zones, as some people call them, actually going to lock in just a few lucky people and prevent their mobility or the turnover that you celebrated with moving day?
I thought you said we were going to disagree.
Oh.
So, I think that we don't have an affordable housing problem in this country. As I said, I spent a week walking around Flint, Michigan. You can have a house if you go to Flint. They don't have enough funding right now to tear down all the abandoned houses they'd like to tear down.
Detroit, same thing.
Detroit, right. There are places in the country where the housing is so cheap that they're giving it away. What we have is a crisis of mobility. You can't live in the places where the jobs are. You can't live in the places where the good education is. You can't live, right? So that's the starting premise here. Once you conceive of it that way, I think you can look at a lot of our housing programs as being immensely counterproductive. Well-intentioned and maybe necessary ameliorative things given the broader environment we've created, but they have perverse effects. I talked to a woman in Flint, Michigan, who had thought about going to live with her sisters in Texas, but she was in an apartment that HUD was subsidizing for $140 a month, and she was never going to find that in Texas. She had that winning lottery ticket, and she genuinely would have been crazy to give it up. There is something perverse about a federal program that pays somebody to stay in Flint, Michigan. And this is broadly true of most of our affordable housing programs, even the ones which are tuned for mobility, like, I'm a fan of this, allowing Section 8 vouchers to be portable,
they are
tuning them so that they can be given counseling and other things to allow people to move toward greater opportunity. It's so hard to find a landlord who's going to take one of those vouchers. The process is so cumbersome that you very rarely get serial moves out of that, right? Somebody moves once and then tend to hang on to the apartment they've been lucky enough to land. All of this happens within an environment of housing scarcity. Because I talked at the beginning about thinking of your housing as like an iPhone we get to upgrade every couple of years. If there was a massive shortage of smartphones in this country, and you knew that if your phone ever broke, you were never going to get another one that was half as good, you would hang on to that phone with all of your might, no matter what. That is the situation we've created with housing, where many of these programs have a good case to be made for them in the present environment. But if you're not expanding the housing stock rapidly enough, you shift everyone's mindset. Think of it like a game of musical chairs, right? If you're setting out a lot of chairs.
That is the New York City housing market.
Yeah, and people are moving around all the time. But if you set out, there's a fixed number of chairs, and there's always more people standing at the edges of the room who want to get in on the game of musical chairs. If you're lucky enough to sit down in a comfortable chair, you're not getting up the next time the music starts, right? You're never going to upgrade. You might as well just stick with what you have. Which is fine if that's what you want, but if somebody gives you a better job offer and you turn it down because it's too far to commute, that's crazy, right? That's not an efficient economic outcome. More than that, it's not a good outcome for a person who is now feeling like their own dreams and ambitions because of housing. If you get that same circle of musical chairs and you start putting out enough chairs every time the music starts that people have the chance to choose a new chair, suddenly the whole conversation shifts. Instead of fretting over gentrification and displacement, people start to see the advent of new housing as an opportunity. Instead of worrying about what percentage of a new development you're setting aside and in the process often further shrinking the market rate housing market and driving up rents for everybody else.
Right.
Right, because if you're setting aside 50% of the units.
Inevitably, the property developer has to make a living somehow.
Yeah, you're going to amortize the cost of those 15% affordable units over the rest of the units in the development, which means that your new market rate units. And then people complain that like all the housing that we're building is luxury housing. I mean, the things are actually tightly interrelated. And yet it's not irrational to create those units if there is no other mechanism for giving people an affordable place to live.
All right, we better get some questions here because we're going to run out of time. So questions from the audience. I think you should be able to see on your screen that you can send in online questions to hadar.zeevi@aei.org. I'm going to get some questions from online. Wait for the microphone. Tell us who you are. Form of a question. Usual rules. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Josh Fertelman. I work at the Mercatus Center. I work on housing policy. I'm curious, I totally get urban changes in zoning, allowing for more dense housing. I'm curious what you think about allowing for more external growth. So there's a big story, I think, in the New York Times Magazine about basically how sprawl has got to be part of solving the housing crisis. I'm curious what you think about that, what kind of communities are created in sort of sprawling areas like north of Dallas, for example, is a big part of the story.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we have an enormous housing crisis in this country, and most of the solutions are going to be yes and rather than either or. That said, we have so constrained the production of new housing in urban areas, which is where the prices have tended to skyrocket the most. I take that as a market signal that there is pent-up demand. More people would like to be living in those places and are making compromises by living further from their jobs, further from other amenities than they would ideally like. If we had, there are some European cities which are sort of donut-shaped, right, where the highest housing prices are out on the periphery and the center is not as expensive. If that was a pattern I was seeing in America, I'd be like, okay, that it makes sense that sprawl would be the biggest part of the answer because that's what people are seeking. I actually see the opposite pattern in the United States, which is that the strongest demand signals are for the densest places. So yes, there needs to be new greenfield development. There's clearly demand for it in some parts of the country. And in general, I'm in favor of letting people live where they want because I think we do a lot better letting Americans make those choices for themselves than trying to set those decisions for them. I just worry that sometimes we misinterpret the demand for things like sprawl because we are blind to the constraints we've imposed in other kinds of housing development. And people need some place to live. And if the only affordable place to live is a new development that is an hour and a half from your job, that's where you're going to live. It may not be the case that you actually want to drive an hour and a half, but that's what's available.
Of course, there's sprawl and there's sprawl. Sprawl doesn't have to be all single-family homes either. It could be multifamily. It could be multifamily with ground floor commercial. There could be a replication of some of that urban density, and we do have jobs on the periphery too.
Yeah, and that's a great point too, right? That a lot of these developments are, the incentives are shaped by zoning codes, by building regulations.
They're constrained.
The builders may think, well, there's actually a lot of demand for small lot single-family homes, for example. We could fit a lot more houses into this development, but we can't. And so we'll develop within the rules rather than trying to peel our way through the process with indefinite delays and capital costs that are associated with it. So I think that there are ways to do new greenfield development that still give people more of what the market keeps telling us they actually want.
Other questions here? Yes, sir, the gentleman right there in the middle.
Hi, my name's Andrew Crouch. I'm a data analyst at the Housing Center here at AEI. Very simply put, why are red states so much better at this?
It's a great question, right? And just to put a point on that, right? Not only are red states growing faster, not only is the population shifting toward red states, but it's not a simple red-blue divide. There's a great study of California which shows that for every additional 10 points in liberal vote share, the number of new housing permits in the jurisdiction goes down by 30%.
Wow.
And so it's the more progressive a jurisdiction, the worse it is at this. There's a couple of things that are feeding in here. One is just a pattern of geopolitical development in the United States, that the red states happen to be in places that were less urbanized 50 years ago. And where, for a variety of other reasons, from the advent of air conditioning to who had the chairmanships of certain defense committees, have benefited from certain patterns of economic growth. And so they had the ability to build around their cities, which were less developed. And in some red states, you can now see them hitting the limits of growth. And so even if the rules weren't that different, there was greater opportunity to build affordable housing, and that is now coming up against its bounds.
Of course, Houston famously does not have a zoning code.
No, it doesn't, although it has lots of other land use regulations, I should say. And you can build a lot more in Houston than you can in other places, but it's got both many more homeowners associations and other private compacts that limit development, and a whole set of land use rules. So it is a better development paradigm in some ways, but in many ways it's just taken the zoning regulations and spread them differently through its code. I think the other part of this answer, though, because there is an actual, I think, philosophical difference, is that there's a strong red state attachment to individual property rights. And conversely, there's a strong blue state belief in the ability of smart government to deliver public goods. And a 21st century progressive obsession with the avoidance of harm. So if you're creating a process in a blue state that prioritizes the avoidance of harm, what you're doing is creating a process with a maximal number of veto points. So anyone who could be harmed in some way by the development, from a endangered species to, the local environment, a group that was traditionally disadvantaged and identifies with the community in which the development is taking place. Like you give neighbors, right? You're giving everybody a chance to weigh in and block the project. And that comes out of a certain theory of governance, whereas in a red state, there's much more a presumption, well, if it's his land, he can do with it what he wants. I think we're going to get, again, up against the limits of that. We can already see this shifting in some red states as they hit some of the limits of how far you can get with large lot single family. And yeah, you get traffic jams, and then as some of those communities start to have fights over, okay, individual property rights are great, but am I really going to let this guy build an apartment building? We'll see more tension in the red states. But I think that those two causes, one, sort of a pattern of geopolitical development, and then the other, some basic differences in political philosophy account for a lot of it.
Other questions? Do we have any online questions? Yes, sir.
Hi. Interesting. You've given us the changes America has gone through, and my impression is the 60s and 70s were the greatest day of this country, and from 1980 onwards, even though we elected Reagan, the country has been going downhill, and I don't like the way the country is now. So do you know who screwed up, and who was the leader who was directing all these?
Let's say that
it has been screwed up.
But do larger political trends relate to the housing problem that you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? So,
the housing as well as the overall well-being. I had a much lower salary in 1970, and I felt a lot better my buying ability than what I have today, even though I have a voucher and all that, and still I don't think it is that good.
It's a great question. And one of the reasons I wrote the book is that I'm thinking a lot about the ways in which the lack of mobility translates to a lack of agency. I think Americans today very often feel as if they're acted upon by larger forces rather than taking control of their own lives. They feel as if something has gone wrong. They have an inchoate sense. Like very few people in an economically depressed part of the country, if you ask them, like, what's wrong with your life? Well, they say, well, I wanted to move last year and I couldn't. And yet they have some sense that this was not the trajectory their life was supposed to be on. So I am trying to tell a story of broader political dysfunction. I would say that in the 1970s, there's a set of legal changes, right? So if the first zoning revolution in the progressive era makes every matter of land use subject to government approval, that doesn't stop American mobility. It separates us out some, it shapes American mobility, but that doesn't stop it. What does stop it is a set of legal changes in the 1970s that introduce many more veto points. So many more reviews become required, and we create
environmental reviews, for instance.
Environmental reviews, other kinds of impacts of new projects, and then we create new legal rights of action. So up until the 1970s, I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but you pretty much needed to demonstrate that you were harmed by something before you could go to court to stop it. And we create all kinds of public interest rights of action, which allow any individual with the time, the money, and the anger to go to court and block anything for about as long as they care to do so. Once you've done that, it gets very, very hard to do things in this country. It gets hard to build housing, which is the story I'm telling. But you can tell similar stories about the construction of infrastructure. You can tell it about government, which has very useful functions and really struggles to perform many of them because not only does it often get blocked in court, but many people within government learn to sort of act within a defensive crouch, doing everything in anticipation of the inevitable lawsuit. And so rather than acting decisively in the public interest, they instead act defensively in a manner that they think
Don't
will get
approve
overturned.
that drug because it might be dangerous.
Yeah, or I would be fine if it was don't approve that drug because it might be dangerous. I get worried when it's don't approve that drug because somebody might sue you.
Yeah, right.
Even if you think it's actually a good drug, right? That's the use case that I really worry about.
Right.
And I think you can see this with housing, you can see it across a broad. So it's a set of legal changes in the 1970s that reorient us away from a society that says, we're going to make lots of mistakes, and the key thing is to live in a place that lets you have lots of second chances, and toward a society which says, first do no harm. And if that's your operating principle, most of the time, it's not just first do no harm, it's first do nothing. I think you get I'm telling a specific story about housing, but you could tell versions of the story about other sectors of society, I think.
Please join me in thanking Yoni Applebaum.